I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Nir Eisikovits, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies. Today, we're delighted to welcome Yuval Levin, one of the most insightful and influential conservative thinkers in America today. He is the director of social, cultural, and constitutional studies at the American Enterprise Institute and editor-in-chief of National Affairs. And he focuses primarily on contemporary political debates in deep institutional history and conservative philosophy. So more of a sociologically informed philosopher than most. And his writing often centers on the critical importance of mediating institutions, the dangers of hyper-polarization, and the need for civic obligation and prudent governance. And I'll say that my memorable interaction with you was brief, but it was back after I'd written Citizen Cyborg and you had written about conservative bioethics. And I gave an uncharitable interpretation of your work, and we had a brief exchange, but I remember you as someone who I thought was among the intellectual interlocutors, the more of conservatives, the one that I would really have wanted to talk to. And I'm glad we finally got the chance.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure you were not uncharitable, and I appreciate it.
And I'll say on a personal note, on my side, Yuval, I'm the somewhat more conservative part of our conversational podcast here. And I have been teaching a class on Burke for many years and have used your great debate book.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Both I and the students like it very much.
That book was my dissertation, so it has a special place in my heart.
I know. I got to tell you, it made me feel very bad about my dissertation.
Well, you should see the actual dissertation. It took a lot of work to get to a place where some human beings could read it.
Anyway, welcome. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you.
Thank you.
Do you have an initial question here?
So, we were going to be, pretty wide ranging, but maybe one place to start. So, we're going to talk about this intersection of bioethics, tech, public policy, looking back to the sort of pictures around the inauguration of the tech elite, very much sort of surrounding the president and supporting them, and having sort of actually just a couple of days ago read this piece in the Times about someone who came from Russia and was very worried about the tech elite sort of enabling rather than serving as a brake on problematic tech policy. I guess I'm really curious about your take on the relationship between politics and the tech elite right now.
Yeah, it's a complicated question, and I think the presence of that tech elite in the Trump orbit is one of the ways in which Trumpism is very different this second time around than it was the first. There really was almost none of that. A few particular individuals who were pretty unusual in Silicon Valley and flocked to Trump, but the kind of connection between Silicon Valley and Trump's Washington that we see now, I think, is distinct to the second time around. And I would say that it emerged more out of, I think, a sense among some people in that tech elite that the left's elite was crowding them out, that they were being pushed around in a kind of woke moment on the left, and the arrangement they had with the Democratic Party had been thrown out. Some of them are exceptionally explicit about this. Mark Andreessen, for example, will just say that the Democratic Party gave up on the deal they had, and so he went to the right. I think that that's how this began, but that there's an element of the, maybe I describe it as post-liberal, anti-liberal sense of where we are in American life that has become more a part of the Trump coalition's view of things. And that is also at home among some people in Silicon Valley. And I think that connection, which is a strange kind of elite populism, as so much of Trumpism is, has to has to do with how this administration thinks about technology and with the place of the tech right in Trump's coalition. There are obviously tensions in that coalition. The tech right is very much in tension with the more traditionalist and socially conservative elements of Trump's coalition. Those tensions have not really emerged very intensely so far, and it'll be interesting to see if they do. But does it worry me? Yes, it worries me. I mean, I think that I think there's a profound unseriousness about politics in Silicon Valley, and that that profound unseriousness is not what Trump's coalition needs, and so there's a lot to worry about.
Speaking of profound unseriousness, Peter Thiel's recent lecture series on the Antichrist, how seriously does anybody, I mean, clearly no theologian takes it seriously, not even the left behind dispensationalists wouldn't take that seriously given the way he's interpreted things, but he's attempting to build a bridge between evangelical apocalyptic Christianity and the tech right. No one on either side, I think, was going to go for that. Do you think?
I doubt it. I think there is that attempt. I think he means it. I mean, I think he's actually thinking about these questions and, has a platform to elevate them in his way. I don't think it's taken all that seriously by people on either side of the argument. It's hard to say, but it certainly doesn't seem to speak to anything in the kind of living theological debates of American Christianity. And I can't imagine it has much of a following in Silicon Valley either. So sometimes you just get a platform because you're, a person with a lot of money. And I think that's what's happening here in part. There's more to the connection between Silicon Valley and Trumpism than that. But I think the actual kind of pseudo-theological arguments probably don't go very far with either end of the coalition. It's my sense.
Well, I was just going to say that in terms of what big tech or the tech right would want from Washington, there's some contradictory motivations. They want both. The right wants various kinds of regulation, and the tech right wants deregulation for the most part. And it seems like that has not yet been resolved, that there's still fights over things like Section 230 and other debates that the tech libertarianism would want to push further. Like with OpenAI now having porn as one of its options, I'm sure the people on the right are not very happy about that, and someone would like to ban that. So how about this conflict between the regulatory and deregulatory tensions with
I think there's no question that that's going to emerge, and in some ways it has already. I would say some of the arguments that were very prominent around Section 230 2 years ago have been submerged because they're not convenient arguments to have right now. And so you just hear a lot less talk about that, I would say. There's much more of a focus on enabling crypto and other things that are also priorities for the tech right, but that are not as much of a problem for the social conservative right. But yeah, I think there are going to be some debates around that question, some problems around it, and porn really is a big issue for social conservatives in Trump's circle. And there's no question that what OpenAI is doing is going to raise concerns and worries, and may draw a real reaction. We'll have to see. Those tensions are very real. They're unavoidable, but there is a desire to hold a coalition together, and I think so far it's held together pretty well despite the contradictions. I would say any genuine political coalition is going to be contradictory. A political coalition rarely makes sense on paper, and so these kinds of tensions are going to be there. I think the question is whether they come to a head on real policy decisions. And honestly, there haven't been a lot of real policy moves so far in this administration, and so there hasn't been a lot that brings these things to a head. The Trump administration so far is governing, I would say, in a retail way, not a wholesale way. They're picking fights, they're making deals in ways that are directed to particular individuals and companies and institutions. They're not making rules. They're not advancing a legislative agenda either. And so far, these debates really haven't come to the fore. I don't know if that's sustainable, but that's been sustained so far for almost a year.
It's a shock and awe against their opposition. Go ahead.
Yuval, if I could go back for a moment to the discussion of the lack of seriousness in Silicon Valley. You know, to sort of paraphrase from Socrates, they're unserious people who are at the same time developing technologies with very serious implications. Maybe not as serious as they like to portray, but AI obviously is going to have massive social and economic implications. In a way that magnifies the weight of the unseriousness, but does the unseriousness, like I'm seeing, two potential sort of descriptions of the unseriousness. One is the sort of maybe somewhat simple-minded notion is that all they care about is making money, and therefore, they'll do what they do to sort of bend the knee to make sure that the cash flow continues. So that's, one kind of unseriousness. Perhaps the other is a sort of lack of principled commitment. So, somebody like Zuckerberg who, discovered some sort of neoconservative masculinity just after he was completely in the other direction, and this sort of ideological flip-flopping. So these are two potential kinds of unseriousness. It's interesting. The Andreessen argument, I'm not impressed by it, but it's at least an argument. And the argument, well, it's a sort of Nietzschean, right, argument where I'm doing something super important. I should get recognition. I shouldn't be subjected to the usual rules. Everybody understood that. Now they don't understand it anymore. So in a way, that's almost more serious. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what the lack of seriousness consists in.
Yeah, well, first of all, I do think Andreessen is more serious, and makes real arguments about the place of progress in American life, the need to be open to innovation in ways that I think are actually quite serious. I would say that at the deepest level, what concerns me about the way in which the people responsible for advancing artificial intelligence are thinking about what they're doing is that it's a form of an argument about the nature of the human person that I think ultimately is dehumanizing. I'd put it this way. I think that it suggests that the human personhood is a function of the ability to coherently answer questions. And so a human person is the kind of thing that can answer questions. This is actually an old argument. It's at the center of many of our debates about bioethics, for example, where we say the youngest and the oldest are no longer capable of answering questions. Are they really human persons? It's also at the center of a lot of our confusion about digital technology and computer technology, where we ask ourselves seemingly profound questions about whether these machines are persons, whether they're sentient, whether they're intelligent, in ways that I think suggest a totally disembodied notion of what the human person is, and that therefore advance in our society an idea of what humanity means that I think is very shallow and emaciated. That's, in a sense, the deepest problem I see there. I think unseriousness is a way of describing something more like an attitude about politics that just isn't very responsible, and that sees it all kind of as a power game and doesn't really think about what our society needs and wants. And I think so far the political instincts of Silicon Valley just haven't been very serious. Now, I think to say something like unserious, we'd have to work a little bit to define it. I don't mean I don't mean to insult people. And they're very capable people. They're very intelligent people. They're doing some very impressive technology work. But the degree to which they are impressed with what they are producing is, I think, pretty unserious. And the notion that this is going to change everything, the notion that this is going to take over the world, that ultimately we're going to get to a place where it's so much more intelligent than us, that it can play with us as pawns, all of that strikes me as quite silly. And look, if they're right and we're doomed, then they're right and we're doomed. But I think if they're not right, then we actually have to think seriously about these technologies as both an opportunity and a challenge for our free society in ways that we have not begun to do. And to think about it in terms that are more like the terms we normally use to think about technology. Our AI debates so far, I think, are just not well rooted either in what our society needs or in what these technologies are. And it's hard. They're new. It's very tough to wrap our heads around them. I certainly would not pretend to have an in-depth understanding of the technology as technology. But the way in which we jump to thinking we're on the verge of this kind of artificial general intelligence, it's just going to be smarter than we are, and at that point we're the second species on Earth, I'm very skeptical.
So you hinted at the philosophical stakes, which I think we want to get to, but you're also then saying something that we often talk about on this show is like, is this really new? Or is there just a continuity of technological changes and reactions to it that fits into a part of? And if this is really new, in what ways will it change things? And on that, I think Nir is still more of a skeptic that we're going to hit something like AGI, where I've always been open to the possibility of an AGI, something like that. But in terms of the philosophical stakes, you kind of laid it out in a way that implies that the question of moral standing that I have always said was a core debate between people on the tech side of this for the last 200 years and the others, the pre-Enlightenment folks. Pre-Enlightenment believes that there's something about the human condition or a human being that has some kind of spiritual essence or essentialness. And the Enlightenment argument, I would say, is that moral standing goes with consciousness and the ability to answer questions, as you put it. And so you see that as a central argument that we've been having for 200 years.
Yeah, I do. And I think in that sense, artificial intelligence gets right to the core of that, because it is a simulacrum of consciousness. And in that sense, the question is, what do we really mean? What are we actually saying? I actually think the fact that we describe these still as large language models is helpful here. These large language models can seem sentient because linguistic expression is how we judge sentience in other people, generally speaking. We express our consciousness through language, and these models operate by predicting the patterns of our language and mimicking those patterns. And so, in a sense, predicting what a human speaker would say next in this situation, it can seem like they're expressing an underlying consciousness because that's what our language does for us. But theirs is a language without an underlying consciousness, and there's not actually a reason, I think, to think otherwise. That they work by predicting patterns of language, and so the only reason to think there's more going on there is our instinctive inclination to identify language with underlying consciousness, which is a good rule of thumb for human beings. But when you separate language from consciousness, as these technologies just do, I think that inclination leads us in the wrong direction. And in a sense, artificial intelligence forces us to ask whether we really mean to say that organized expression of ideas is identical to consciousness, and consciousness is the essence of human personhood. And I'm on the side that would answer no to both of those. I think human personhood is tied up with embodiment in a way that cannot be ignored. The two cannot be separated. That ultimately consciousness expresses something about ourselves, but the expression is not the thing. And I do think that this is a moment to recur to Aristotelian categories, because we're being forced to ask exactly what we mean by consciousness by a technology that offers us a simulacrum of it that really tests our categories. I ultimately think human beings are all possessed of a fundamental equal dignity that is not a function of our capacities, and especially of our rational capacities. Obviously, there's a difference of opinion about this, a serious difference of opinion about it. I don't suggest that the opposing view is not philosophically grounded or seriously thought out. But yeah, these technologies really force us to have that debate in most fundamental form, even more than the biotechnologies of 25 years ago did, because they really are about a simulated consciousness and ask us to explain ourselves when we say that consciousness is the essence of personhood.
And just to be clear, on those grounds, you would argue that from conceptus until heart death, people have that moral standing?
Yeah, we are embodied from beginning to end. We're the same creature, and so yes, I think human beings are human beings from beginning to end.
And that animals don't have it as the consequence of that. No, great apes wouldn't have any moral standing.
I wouldn't say any moral standing, but their moral standing is a function of their similarity to us, and so they're really a function of our categories. I don't think they have the same moral standing as a human person. I don't think they have zero moral standing either.
So even an animal that had the same stuff going on could answer the same questions, you wouldn't give them the same moral standing?
Oh, I don't know. I think that would force us to ask ourselves what we're looking at. I do think it would matter. I don't have a simple answer to that question.
No. So, Yuval, what I hear you saying is that we have to sort of that this technology forces us into a more into the need for a more explicit discussion of our conceptions of personhood before we can say anything about the status of the machines itself. And I'm just sort of playing with the idea of 5 to 10 years from now, there will be efforts to embody large language models in more and more human-like robotics and increase the...
Now, it's happening now.
Yeah,
right.
It's just not super impressive yet, but it looks like it will be. And so...
I think their claims to embodiment will be more impressive than their claims to consciousness.
Are there other parts, maybe from some of your sort of Burkean leanings for human personhood that sort of grate against the technological incarnation of it? So, for example, this sort of connection, this continuity with past traditions that persons aren't just born over and over and sort of have to discover everything.
Isn't one of the complaints of a Burkean that technology is making things change too fast and things are breaking?
Well, not necessarily. I don't blame technology for making things change too fast. I think there are ways in which technologies can sometimes blind us to the continuity of things, can make it seem as though everything is changing when in fact the most important thing, the nature of the human person, doesn't really change, and every generation essentially confronts the same kinds of challenges as every other generation. I'm not I'm not an anti-technologist, and I don't think Edmund Burke was either, as I understand him. He was a classical liberal, and I see myself that way too. I think that there are challenges to the conception of the human person that are essential to classical liberalism that can emerge from some kinds of uses we make of technology. That's a lot of what we have had to contend with in modern life, but technologies have also provided us with enormous power, and I think the challenge is to find a balance, to use these technologies in ways that help us flourish rather than undermine our capacity to flourish, but I certainly wouldn't just reject them.
I mean, one of the features of the sort of recurring features of human nature that I've been really curious about in the context of emerging technologies is our consistent tendency to anthropomorphize so much of what we come into touch with, to project human qualities onto so much of what we come in touch with. And this technology in particular is very susceptible to it and will become more and more. Large language models are very susceptible to it as we see people developing relationships with them, and will become more and more so if and when it does become embodied. And so I was curious about what you thought that kind of increasingly understandable anthropomorphization means for the status of the technology.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think anthropomorphizing is a problem in that it constrains our sense of what the human is more than in that it expands our sense of what other things in the world are. That is, we when we say that the machine is like a person, the more important part of that statement is that we are saying a person is like a machine. And we come to constrain and limit our sense of what a human person is. I think that's always been the problem. The oldest of old Jewish arguments against idolatry, you find this in Psalm 115, is that people become what they idolize. They come to be like the idols they create. I'd really actually point people to Psalm 115, which is very interesting to read today. It says the idols have eyes but can't see, have ears but can't hear, have hearts but can't feel, and those who make them become like them. I think there's actually a very profound statement there about the risks we run with technologies like AI, that we come to constrain our sense of our own capacities on the basis of an understanding of their capacities. And very often that's what anthropomorphizing actually does to us, is it deforms our sense of what we are more than expanding too far our sense of what a machine can do or an idea can do. I do think we see that problem with modern digital technology in general. I certainly think we will see a lot of it with artificial intelligence. And some of that language of idolatry and counter-idolatry is what we're going to require. Ultimately, the response to that kind of idolatry is a form of discipline, is an investment in certain practices that enable us to flourish, that are not inherently necessary in the terms we recognize. The investment in the Sabbath, in the separation, the disconnection from the world that threatens to deform our perception of ourselves, I think is more important than ever. And the way to remain healthy human beings in the world of social media, let alone AI, is going to involve certain disciplines, is going to involve forcing ourselves to separate now and then from it, forcing ourselves to invest in reading and in writing and in ways that help us to think, that might seem like they become less necessary now. Writing's a lot easier now. You can sit down and ask ChatGPT for help putting an essay together, and you don't really have to think your way to that argument. But thinking your way to that argument is why being a writer can be valuable for someone who wants to be a thinker. So I think these kinds of questions of what sorts of practices make us human, what sorts of habits do we need to flourish, are just going to need to be thought about more consciously in an age in which AI plays a bigger role. And, there are ways that can be good for us. There are ways in which it presents new challenges. But I think the fundamental problem is an old problem. This is the way in which you're going to run into me as a conservative over and over. I think the basic human challenges don't change that much. And getting from what we are when we enter the world to what a flourishing human being is just going to require a kind of moral formation that's best provided by family and community and high-minded education and formative socialization. That's always been true. It's still true. There's some new challenges to it now. There's some old challenges that we don't face anymore because we live in free liberal societies, and that's a great thing. But the basic problem is still the problem.
I'm not sure it's conservative to say that we've always faced the same problems. I mean, one of my favorite philosophers said that all of history is the history of class struggle. That seems like an argument that we keep confronting the same problem. And when you talk about idolatry, I mean, I'll grant you that there's tech idolatry, but we live in a country where a third of Americans have made Donald Trump a saint, the head of their church, even when these Christians were warned that the Antichrist would clothe himself in the cloth of the church. And he's attempting to turn us into a totalitarian country. And so I'm just a little hesitant to go down the road talking about tech idolatry when the idolatry that is a threat to the world right now is the idolatry of politics and the right.
Amen. I don't disagree with any of that. I absolutely think we should be aware of idolatry in all realms of our lives. and the existence of it in one place is not proof against the existence of it in another. I would say that.
But how does a small L liberal in Washington in a conservative think tank react to the fact that an authoritarian demagogue is about to destroy American democracy?
I mean, look, you can see it in my work. I am very much opposed to the direction our politics is taking now, and I think the way to argue against it is to make the case for constitutionalism and liberal democracy. That is my day job. I don't argue about AI for a living. I'm doing it because you asked me. Most of what I do is very much on that front and not on this front.
Got it.
Well, that's an actually very interesting point of agreement and convergence between the two of you, Jay and Yuval. The sort of emphasis on worrying about what politicians do with technology rather than worrying about the status of the technology in itself. I guess I have more questions about that. And Yuval, I wanted to ask you in that context, so this idea, which usually I'm super sympathetic to, about the persistence of the basic human challenges, are there any technologies that change the basic human challenges, or is that a constant? Because my sense is, for example, the biggest cliche, nuclear weapons very much change our, horizon of extinction. Simulated consciousness, as you put it, I think that, maybe adds a few other basic challenges, at least the possibility that we become, and you're right, there's much more needed articulation and copying of personhood before we get there, but it at least raises the possibility on the horizon that we become a second-rate species. So I guess I do have this more Heideggerian sense that some technologies, a very small minority of them, do profoundly, change the very nature of human challenges.
Well, I think I could go with you to a very small minority of them, and I tend to think that those are biotechnologies that can fundamentally transform the relationship between generations of human beings. That by taking control, if that were possible, of the actual genetic form of the human person, we do run a risk of changing the reason why human problems generally don't change from generation to generation, which is that every generation begins in the same place as every prior generation. It does not begin where its parents left off. It begins where they started. And it requires the same formation they required to be capable of the same exercise of freedom that they were capable of. That means we always need education. It means we always need family in some form. It means we always need to think about how to help a human person become capable of thriving, capable of exercising freedom. The fact that we all start in the same place is, I think, the fundamental beginning point of my kind of conservatism. It's why we need to preserve the institutions that make human flourishing possible. Those can look different in different societies, but they serve very similar purposes. And conservatives, in the end, want to conserve those institutions. I think that if the premise of that were to change, if the fact that we begin where every generation began were not to be true anymore, then a lot of things could change. I don't think that's where we are. I don't think that's possible where we now stand, but it's imaginable. In that sense, I go along with some of the students of Heidegger, Hans Jonas, for example, who really saw things this way, or Leon Kass, my teacher, who I think of as a student of Jonas. I do think those concerns are genuine. I think differently about something like nuclear weapons or, at least so far, even AI, because the challenges those pose have to do with the corruption of human character, with the very oldest kinds of human problems. The reason they're dangerous is that we are dangerous, and the way for us to become less dangerous is to be better formed as human beings. Those are the oldest problems. They're not new problems, as I understand it.
And germline genetic engineering and the sort of overcoming of evolution, that's the traditional idea of evolution that's implicated in that. I mean, that would also seem to be dangerous because
I think that poses a very different kind of problem, yeah.
But isn't that also dangerous because we're dangerous and hubristic and
sure,
reach too high?
But it means that the character of the human person in future generations really could be different from that of past generations.
Got it.
That's what makes it different, as I understand things.
Got it.
So we could be at the end of history, but it's because history is going to change given our technologies. I had mentioned Frank Fukuyama, who is another person I've paid a lot of attention to, and I've always been puzzled by, okay, you thought there was an end of history, but then you met transhumanism and suddenly you realized that maybe things could change in fundamental ways. But that seems to, and you seem to have argued that other political issues, economic issues have moved to the fore, the political fore, and that these biopolitical issues that were being discussed more 20 years ago have moved back. Do you think that biopolitics or technopolitics is going to become more prominent, especially with the tech right, as one of our foils?
Well, with the tech right, sure, but I think whether they become more prominent in general, I don't see it. I mean, I think in a way the mystery to be explained is why they were so prominent in the early 2000s, not why they're not prominent now. And I think they were very prominent in those years, frankly, because they created a political opportunity to argue about the abortion question in a different way than had been possible before. And there were some people on the political left who saw that as a vulnerability for the right, and it was a vulnerability. And so those issues just became massively important. They were prominent in the presidential convention in the party convention, the Democratic Party National Convention in 2004 in a way that we just have never seen before or since. And I think that had everything to do with the abortion debate. You had a situation where the position of opponents of abortion about the nature of the human embryo posed an obstacle to medical research. Medical research is very popular, with good reason, and that meant that it was possible to make an argument about abortion that was very popular, which is not generally possible for either side of the abortion debate. And so it was pushed very hard, and it became a huge issue for a brief time. I think it turned out that cell biology just didn't go in the direction that anybody expected. And I would say not only the boosters, but the critics of it, like myself, also thought that it actually would make possible all kinds of things.
Turns out we don't need fetuses.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the fact that turned out to be the case just made these issues drop into the background again. I don't see them coming back to the kind of prominence they had in the early 2000s. I think they're very important, but a lot of very important things don't really attract a lot of public attention. And it seems to me these are probably going to stay in that category for the foreseeable future.
But we are at the situation now where firms are going to be offering a wide variety of Gattaca-style tests for prenatal stuff. The president offered, and then, of course, immediately forgot the offer of free IVF for every American woman, which would have dramatically expanded that particular potentiality. Ozempic is the first truly effective treatment for obesity, and we have this debate about how we get it in everybody's hands. I mean, it seems like there's lots of biopolitical issues popping out, and at the same time, we're destroying the FDA. And
I think the IVF issue became prominent for a minute last year for the same reason that it did in the 2000s. It was, again, possible to argue about the question of the human embryo in a way that created an opportunity for one of the sides in the abortion debate. As you say, the president very quickly forgot what he had to say on that front. There's some action on IVF in the administration. There was some just this week, but not nearly at the level that it seemed like it might take up public attention last year. I certainly agree. These issues are immensely important. I also agree there's a lot of damage being done to the FDA in ways that are not being thought through. I just don't know that it's capable of grabbing public attention on the scale that it did in the 2000s. Whether it should, I think it probably should, but I don't expect that it will.
I mean, one area that might very soon grab public attention is, and then, here we go back perhaps to the spirit of the Beyond Therapy report that you were instrumental at producing under George W. Bush's Bioethics Commission. But germline genetic engineering now coupled with CRISPR
Yeah.
was just waiting for AI to sort of come along and make clear the path potentially from genes to traits. And now that was the main thing that we couldn't figure out until recently, and therefore we kind of had all the tools but didn't have the fuel, or whatever metaphor you want to use. Those coming together, I do think, whatever one's position overall about AI, I do think one of the potentially tremendous benefits is going to be helping to figure out the path from genes to traits. So it seems to me that question is going to come back on the agenda with a vengeance pretty soon.
I agree with that. First of all, I agree with your assessment of what AI could do in that field. That certainly seems right, and I do think, therefore, that it can make possible various kinds of technologies that have only been science fiction until now. I think that deserves a lot of public attention, and I suspect it will not get a lot of public attention. So, there are a lot of important things happening here in the background in biotech in this moment, and it seems to me that there's a lot to be thought through and worked out if in fact we're on the verge of being capable of genetic engineering of a sort that all sorts of people, supporters and opponents, have talked about for decades. I don't think that the public policy terrain is prepared to think about that. I don't think our policymakers are ready to take it seriously. And, I guess I think what's going to happen is going to happen, and we're going to respond to it in retrospect. That's very often how the American regulatory system works. There are costs and benefits to that. We're going to pay the costs and reap the benefits, because that's, I think, where we're going.
I was listening to Malin Baker, a British political thinker, on YouTube yesterday, and he was comparing the current situation to the Borgias and the idea that some elites Machiavellianly want to just create chaos so that they can increase their power. And I was thinking about that in relationship to your focus on intermediate institutions. We have had the erosion of intermediate institutions, the bowling alone phenomenon, and it's accelerated in the last 15 years, and many people point at people's phones for that. And I presume that you're sympathetic with that account, that technology has accelerated the decline of intermediate institutions. But I think for a techno-progressive like myself, the question is always, okay, well, we can stand here and yell at people that they're not doing the right thing and they should get back into church and go back to the bowling league. Or we can say what new forms of intermediate institutions are possible and perhaps even more likely given these new technological affordances. And do we see evidence that people are beginning to fulfill these basic human needs through these new technological avenues? And you're not optimistic that we're going to find I'm not sure that playing World of Warcraft with your friends across the world is really fulfilling the same needs as going to church, but don't you think that could potentially?
Yeah, no, look, I first of all, I would say I don't think that the breakdown of these intermediate institutions has fundamentally been driven by technology. I don't really blame technology for that exactly, because it's a much longer trend. The great defining text in this kind of communitarian space that I occupy is a book called The Quest for Community, written by the sociologist Robert Nisbet. I read that book with students every year, and they feel like it describes their situation. That book was written in 1953, a time that I frankly think of as a kind of high point for American civic life and for the strength of our civic institutions. And Nisbet saw the breakdown then, described it then in ways that still feel timely. And I think someone like myself has to wrestle with exactly what that means. Does that mean he was ahead of his time? That's true in part. Does that mean these things have always been an element of a sort of risk looking democratic societies in the face? I think there's some truth to that. Tocqueville saw some of this in the 1830s, after all. Society did not fall apart after the 1830s or the 1950s. And, I think we have to take seriously, again, the fact that these kinds of troubles, these kinds of challenges face free societies in every generation. I don't blame the internet for the decline of civil society. Now, it's accelerated some elements of it, certainly. So it's made some things worse. I do think, as you say, it's also made some things better. It is easier now to find a community of like-minded people than it has ever been before. And if your particular interest, if you're a conservative scholar of the American Constitution, well, it's a lot easier now to be part of a club like that than it used to be, and to know what other people in your community are doing, what they're up to, what they think, and really to know them, to know their families. I've found that that's now possible in ways that would have been much harder for someone like myself 2 generations ago. At the same time, these technologies have forced us to think about what these mediating institutions actually provide us. And I would say that, and this is really something that I came to think in the course of COVID, where we were very separated and connected digitally instead of personally. I think these technologies force us to recognize that there are 2 things that happen when people come together. There is communication and there's communion. There's exchanging information and there's being together. And these technologies have made it much easier to exchange information. We can be in touch much more readily than used to be the case. And a lot of what we need is communication. But they've made it much easier to avoid communion, to no longer be with other people. And it's much easier today because of our modern technologies to live as a functional loner in American life. In fact, a lot of the most attractive and appealing technologies of the 21st century are there to enable us to spend less time with people, to interact less with people. You can just walk into the restaurant, your food's in a bag with your name on it, you pick it up and you walk out. You never made eye contact with anybody. That's much more efficient, but there's just less humanity to it. There's something missing there. I think that should force us to be more specific about what we think is missing and lacking in modern life that leaves people feeling lonely, that leaves people feeling isolated. And I do think that we confront a challenge on that front because it is easier now to live a lonely, isolated life. We need other people less genuinely. And so we have to help ourselves define the need for communion more self-consciously. And again, as I said before, we're going to have to be more disciplined about seeking it. We're going to have to seek it by denying ourselves some of the benefits of these technologies. And that's just a hard thing to do. So, in some ways, the problems are sharpened by the internet, and I'm sure it'll also be so by AI in various ways. But I don't think they're fundamentally technology-driven problems. And so I don't think we solve them by rejecting the internet and AI. I think we solve them by asking ourselves, what do we need? And seeing if there are even ways that these technologies can help us get that, or that approaching them in a certain way can help us get that. This is a vague answer because I don't have the answer, but I do think that we shouldn't fall into any kind of simple anti-technologism. I just don't think that's a practical way to live in the 21st century, and I don't think it's a good idea.
I'm really tempted, Yuval, to sort of ask you almost as a kind of summary question, or question that brings together some of the threads that you were following. What does a Burkean tech ethics focus on? I'm hearing it focuses on the perennial nature of our questions, that it focuses on the need for communion and not just communication, focuses on the importance of institutions surviving rather than being smashed in fascination with some new technology that potentially replaces them. Is that?
Yeah, but that's another way of saying that it isn't really tech ethics. It's just ethics. Yeah. And that is certainly my answer. I think we should not live as though technology has changed all the questions. The question is still, how do human beings flourish? And the answer just hasn't changed very much. There are some ways that it has changed. It is much easier to flourish in a modern free society than it was in a pre-modern unfree society. We should be grateful for that. There are also some challenges that are posed to human flourishing by the sheer extent of freedom that we have, and we should be frank about that too. But the basic underlying questions of how a human being flourishes, I don't think we've made a huge amount of progress in answering those questions since about the time that Aristotle was stitched together with Judaism and Christianity. And I'm that conservative, and I still think we basically need to find ways to apply those approaches to contemporary challenges and opportunities.
So just to follow up on that, I mean, I'm super sympathetic, and I'm going to play, and I'm kind of surprised to see some of the parallels. Now they make sense between your thought and Jay's much more progressive thought, actually, on that question of the problem is usually with politics, policy, and ethics rather than with the tools. But I do, for both of you, I do want to bring up two of, to some of the greatest correlations in the history of social science from the last 20 years, which is pretty much since the introduction of the iPhone and the building up of social media platforms that followed that, you have had two crises, both psychological and political. The psychological crisis mainly afflicting young girls of a profound mental health crisis that correlated with the rise of social media and the introduction of the iPhone. And the other has been this kind of soft totalitarianism, Brave New World type totalitarianism rise, which also seems technologically enabled everywhere from Russia to China to Hungary. Some would say a version, certainly here, a version of it in Israel. Doesn't that correlation suggest the need for a sort of dedicated tech ethics rather than a general ethics?
Well, honestly, I would say to me, it does not. I think the basic problems are the basic problems. And yes, there's no question that there is now a form of the of the temptation to escape the necessity of moral formation that has to do with phones. Yeah, but it's not the phone that created that temptation. It's the fact that we are vulnerable to it is a fact about us, and the basic needs are still the basic needs. So the solution to it isn't going to require a profound familiarity with the technologies involved. It's going to require a profound familiarity with the nature of the human person. And that is what we risk losing, but that is always what we risk losing. So I think we're going to find ways to have a more healthy relationship with iPhones and the internet. Eventually, we're going to find ways to have a healthier relationship with artificial intelligence too, if we begin from some premises about ourselves. And by the way, I would argue that we are finding some healthier ways to do that. There's now a very, very widespread understanding that we've been misusing and abusing the technological gifts of the 21st century in ways that have been bad for our children. And I think it's not just girls, by the way. It offers girls what they're most vulnerable to, maybe, this kind of deforming social comparison technology. It offers boys endless targets for addiction, which is what boys are prone to.
And hate.
Yeah, and hate, exactly. Those vulnerabilities are not new. The technologies are new, but the problem was not invented by Steve Jobs. And I don't think that it's going to help us to blame the technology for the underlying problem. And I don't think we solve the problem by banning the technology either. I think we solve the problem by being more serious about what it takes for a human being to flourish, and therefore engaging more consciously in the kinds of disciplines and habits that are required for that formation. That does become harder in some ways in a technological age, but it becomes easier in some ways too. I just think the basic problems and solutions don't change that much. That is the way in which I'm a conservative.
Yeah, I guess my sort of considered response, the more sophisticated than my initial question would be, the problems are certainly perennial. There can be ways in which the technology makes dealing with perennial problems more difficult than it was in the past. So, for example, if our capacity to pay attention has in the last 15 years been decimated, then it's going to be harder to deal with the problem that, while perennial, we had more of an attention span to deal with 25 years ago.
I agree with you, but I think, again, we have to see that, I mean, in a sense, I'd put it this way. Life is always getting better and worse at the same time. And we have to pay attention to the ways in which it's getting worse so that it doesn't go off the rails. We have to be grateful for the ways in which it's getting better, which are easy to take for granted. So, yes, there are ways in which we are now more prone to certain kinds of human failures and failings and vices than we used to be. There are also ways in which we are less so. We live in a society that's much more likely to respect human beings as dignified equals than was the case 1,000 years ago. That is extremely helpful. Absolutely.
We had slavery 1,000 years ago.
That's what I mean. We live in a society that is much more capable of treating people as dignified equals today than was the case 1,000 years ago. Much more capable.
No, I absolutely
agree. To not
agree.
be grateful for modern liberal societies would be insane.
Yeah,
I think we have to be able to see the ways in which we have tools now for living an ethical life that we didn't used to have. We also have obstacles to living an ethical life that we didn't used to have. That means our basic challenge, how to live an ethical life given the world we're in, has not changed. That was our father's challenge and our grandfather's challenge. If we're lucky and we don't ruin things, it'll be our children's challenge and our grandchildren's challenge too. We have to be up to it in our own time, but that doesn't mean that everything has changed.
Well, it sounds like we have to have another conversation about moral enhancement, because it seems like that's the technological answer to this concern about what a eudaimonia in a future could be. Yeah, so I mean, our basic neural architecture has stayed the same for 200,000 years, but we may be able to change that now. And what kinds of people should we be?
Well, I don't trust us to do it, for what it's worth.
I thought not.
Yeah, I always tell Jay that when we became evolution for dogs, we created labradoodles, and so should we be trusting? I have one and I love them, but they're crazy.
Make yourself a Great Dane.
Yeah, yeah, I'm with you, Val, on that one. I just don't think we have the God's eye perspective to be in charge of moral enhancement. Yuval, this has been wonderful. Thank you. I know
Thank you both for a great conversation. I appreciate it.
We'll have to have you back to argue with Jay about moral enhancement.
Please, anytime.